Welcome to Americana Archives. Today we have part 1 of the story with the headline, A Railroad Adventure. It says, we copy the following from the series of Heroic Deeds of Heroic Men in Harper's Monthly Magazine for July 1865. It will add to the interest of many of our readers to know that one of the adventurers engaged in this most perilous enterprise was Lieutenant Pittenger, now Reverend Mr. Pittenger, pastor of the Methodist Episcopal Church at Rhodestown. One of the most chivalric and daring deeds performed during the Civil War in America was enacted by a band of 24 young men in Georgia in the month of April 1862. General O.M. Mitchell was then marching across the state of Tennessee, having descended from the Ohio, and was aiming for Chattanooga, a strategic point of great importance. There was a very important railroad which ran from Memphis on the Mississippi River to Charleston, South Carolina on the Atlantic coast. This road passed through the important points of Corinth, Huntsville, Chattanooga, and Atlanta, Georgia. General Mitchell, with his division, was at that time lying at Murfreesboro and was moving on to Shelbyville, a very pleasant town on Duck River. The rebels held Chattanooga and the railroad from that place to Atlanta. Thus, troops and munitions of war could easily be transported from one of these important points to the other. Could we succeed in cutting the railroad between these 2 points and in destroying the bridges, we might then seize Chattanooga before reinforcements could be sent from Atlanta for its relief. We should thus gain possession of all of East Tennessee. The rebel army would be cut in two, and indeed injury would be inflicted, which seemed almost to threaten the very existence of the Confederacy. It was not possible at that time to send an army by a long march to attack the rebels, who were stationed in considerable force along the road, and to take it from them by main force. The most feasible plan was to send a detachment of bold men in the common dress of the country on a secret expedition to burn the bridges. The only way in which this daring exploit could be accomplished was for the adventurers to work their way through the rebel lines to Atlanta, there seize by surprise a locomotive, urge it at its fullest speed toward Chattanooga, stopping only to apply the torch to the bridges behind them, and to rush on by Chattanooga till they reached a point of safety within our army lines near Huntsville, to which point General Mitchell was rapidly moving. A deed of more perilous and romantic courage has perhaps never been undertaken. The results to be attained were commensurate with the hazards of the adventure. The Southern Confederacy, a prominent rebel journal, commenting upon the enterprise, says, "The mind and heart shrink back, appalled at the bare contemplation of the awful consequences which would have followed the success of this one act. We doubt whether the victory of Manassas or Corinth were worth as much to us as the frustration of this one coup d'etat. It is not by any means certain that the annihilation of Beauregard's whole army at Corinth would have been so fatal to us as would have been the burning of the bridges at that time by these men." 24 young men of established reputation for intelligence and bravery were selected for the chivalric adventure. In parties of 2 and 3, in citizens' dress, they met in an appointed rendezvous in a grove near Shelbyville, Tennessee. It was Monday, the 10th of April, 1862. Here they matured their plans. Assuming that they were Kentuckians, discussed it with the government of Abraham Lincoln, and that they were seeking an asylum in the South. They broke up into squads of 3 or 4 and traversed as rapidly as possible the sparsely settled country to rendezvous on Thursday the 13th at Chattanooga in the midst of one of the throng encampments of the rebels. The distance to be traveled on foot was a little over 100 miles. Through multiplied difficulties and many hairbreadth escapes, they worked their way along over the rugged spurs of the Cumberland Mountains until they reached the Tennessee River, nearly opposite Chattanooga. There was a horse ferry boat there, and a great and motley crowd of people, drawn by curiosity or the exigencies of war, were waiting to be conveyed across. After many embarrassments, the adventurers succeeded in crossing the river, having eluded all the surveillance of the patrols and guards. The news had just reached Chattanooga that General Mitchell had taken possession of Huntsville on the railroad, scarcely 100 miles west of their encampment. These tidings created a great excitement and almost consternation in the rebel ranks. Chattanooga had been until about that time a small unknown village, buried from the world in the midst of towering mountains, and situated on the eastern, or rather southern bank of the Tennessee. The little town presented an air of great tumult and bustle, crowded as it then was with soldiers and civilians and all the followers of an army. Our adventurers, mingling with the crowd and wearing the common dress of the country, hastened to the depot, purchased their tickets for Atlanta, and entered the cars. Some of their comrades had arrived earlier and had already taken a train of cars from Marietta, but a few miles this side of Atlanta. It was late in the afternoon. The cars were crowded mostly with soldiers, so that there was scarcely standing room. The rebels had just received false news of some astounding victories. They were greatly elated. As the cars rolled along, jokes, laughter, and oaths rang through the night air. Marietta was the point at which they were to take the cars, preparatory for their bold achievement. At midnight, the cars reached that station. The party repaired to different hotels, having arranged to meet in the depot at 4 o'clock in the morning to take the train going back to Chattanooga. J.J. Andrews of Kentucky, a man of extraordinary character and who was perfectly familiar with the South, was chief of the expedition and managed all its details with great sagacity. By the casualties of the journey, 2 of the young men were absent, and there were but 22 who took passage on the train. A short ride brought them to a station called Big Shanty. There was at this place an encampment of nearly 10,000 conscripts. Here the car stopped for a few moments, while the engineer, conductor, and many of the passengers stepped into an eating house for refreshments. Andrews rose from his seat and said calmly, "Let us go, boys." Mingling with the crowd of passengers, and of course attracting no attention, they moved forward leisurely to the head of the train. 2 of them, W. Brown and William Knight from Ohio, were accomplished railroad engineers. One of the men stealthily uncoupled the baggage cars, upon which the rest had clambered from the remainder of the train, while the 2 engineers, who were at their post, pulled open the valve and put on all steam. In less time than we have taken to describe it, the locomotive was rushing forward at its highest speed. There were 4 or 5 rebel regiments within 40 rods of the spot from which the locomotive started. We may imagine the bewilderment with which they gazed upon the receding engine as it disappeared in the distance. Our brave adventurers were too much exhilarated by the excitement of the hour to observe the amazement with which the sudden flight of the engine was regarded by the thousands who were grouped around. Onward they rushed, with almost lightning speed, in silent sublimity of emotion, too deep to find expression in smiles or words. Thus far, everything had succeeded according to their most sanguine expectations. With some anxiety, however, they looked upon the telegraph wires running along their side. Though they had taken the precaution to start from a depot where there was no telegraph station, still it was a matter of much moment that as speedily as possible they should cut the wires. Having run about 4 miles, they stopped, and while one of their number, John Scott of Ohio, climbed the pole and sawed off the wire, others tore up a rail to slow any pursuers. They were now all overjoyed with their success, and warmly they congratulated each other with the prospect of the triumphant termination of their chivalric enterprise. Andrews had taken the precaution to ascertain what down trains he had to pass, and where to pass them. There was, as they supposed, but 1 train for them to meet on that day. But in consequence of some military necessity, the rebels had put on that day 2 special trains. When they had arrived at the point where the down train was to pass, quite to their consternation, they found that it bore a red flag, thus announcing that another train was following behind. They had, however, still the track for a little time to themselves, and they moved along slowly, for they were ahead of time, to a side track where they were to wait for the special train to pass. Thus they lost 25 precious minutes. It was an awful loss. The pursuers were now upon their track. As soon as the waited-for train was in sight, and they were just ready to push on with renewed velocity, much to their dismay, they saw that this train also bore a red flag, announcing still another train behind. They, however, pushed on to the next station, hoping there to pass the train. In the meantime, they cut the wires between the 2 stations, and hurriedly through such impediments as were at hand behind them upon the track. Just as they were trying with almost the energies of despair to wrench up one of the rails, they heard the whistle of an engine in pursuit. With frantic strength they broke the rail in 2 and threw the fragment upon their car as they sprang upon it. Encouraged by the hope that this would delay their pursuers for some time, they rushed onward and reached the spot where they passed the downcoming train in safety. They now goaded their engine to its utmost possible speed, at times attaining a velocity of 60 miles an hour. Still the foe crowded closely behind. No longer was there any thought of burning the bridges or tearing up the road. Indeed, only a miracle could enable them to escape with their lives. Onward and still onward they dashed, passing stations and villages with meteoric speed and roar, exciting amazement in all beholders as they witnessed the apparently terrific flight of the locomotive, followed with equal velocity by an engine with 3 cars attached, loaded with excited soldiers. After running in this manner about 100 miles, their wood and water gave out, their oil was expended, and the foe was in sight. They were then within about 15 miles of Chattanooga. Their pursuers were close upon them. Their situation was desperate, and there was no alternative before them but to leap from the train and take to the woods, each one to save himself as he might. They jumped from the car while still in motion, and running, some to the right and others to the left, were soon dispersed through the forest of pines. Escape, however, was under the circumstances almost hopeless. It was Saturday, the 12th day of April. It so happened that there was a regimental muster nearby, and many planters were present with their horses and bloodhounds. This whole force of soldiers, planters, and hounds was immediately put upon the pursuit of the fugitives. By means of these fierce dogs, who had been trained in the pursuit of the unhappy slaves, every one of these heroic adventurers were captured. There was one orphan boy, Jacob Parrott, only 18 years of age. He belonged to the 33rd Regiment of Ohio Volunteers. When seized by the infuriated rebels, who manifested a degree of ferocity which would have disgraced savages, they took the poor boy, bent him down almost doubled over a large stone, and while 4 of the chivalry held him down in that stooping posture by his hands and his feet, a rebel officer in a lieutenant's uniform with a rawhide laid upward of 100 lashes upon his bare back. A riotous crowd were shouting around, all of them clamoring for his blood. A rope was brought with which they insisted that he should be hung. 3 times during the progress of this merciless scourging, it was suspended, when they demanded of the heroic young patriot that he should divulge the names of his comrades, the designs of the expedition, and especially the name of the engineer who ran the train. They only ceased their brutal work when they found that the task of subduing their victims was hopeless. The 20 captives, when taken, were all thrust into the jail at Chattanooga. They were thrown into a damp, dirty, miserable cell, half undergrown, as gloomy as the world-renowned oubliettes of the Bastille. This dungeon was 13 feet square. In this room, over 30 victims of Southern barbarism were crowded together. Many of them were Southern men, who for the crime of refusing to join in rebellion and treason had been subjected to almost every conceivable outrage. The only entrance was by a trap door opening from the floor above. 2 small windows, thickly barred with iron, let in a few rays of light and scarcely air enough to support life. The horrors of the Black Hole in Calcutta were unsurpassed by those endured in this miserable dungeon. There was not space enough for all to lie down together, and these heroic men, whose sublime daring should have at least have won respect, were exposed to barbarities which were a disgrace to the 19th century. There is not a civilized nation on the globe which would have treated prisoners of war, or even the most loathsome criminals, with cruelty so revolting. But slavery had converted the South into a state of semi-barbarism. The pursuit, as described by the rebels, must have been nearly as exciting as the flight. The conductor and engineer of the train were quietly breakfasting in the Big Shanty Hotel at Camp McDonald, when to their indescribable amazement, the locomotive with the baggage car took its flight. The rebels seem ever to have been inspired with an incentive consciousness of the audacity of the Yankees. It was at once surmised that this was a chivalric adventure of their terrible foes. The engineer, conductor, and foreman of the wood department immediately started upon the run, apparently chasing the engine, which was whirling away at the rate of 20 miles an hour. This at first excited the most boisterous shouts of laughter from the thousands of soldiers who were standing around. But the pursuers knew well what they were about. Having run about 3 miles, they came to a handcar. This they seized and pushed forward with new speed. When they came to an upgrade, they pushed it before them. On the downgrades, they could advance with great velocity. At length, they came to a place where the Patriots had torn up a rail. In their eagerness, not noticing this, they were all thrown, car and men, pell-mell on one side of the road. The car was replaced on the track, and the rebels were again in full pursuit. Thus they pushed on for 20 miles, till they came to Etowah Station, where there chanced to be a locomotive fired up and all ready for a start. This they seized. Putting on a full head of steam, they soon reached Kingston, where they learned that the adventurers were but 20 minutes ahead of them. Here they found a locomotive capable of much higher speed, which was fired up, waiting for the arrival of a passenger train when it was to proceed by a branch road to Rome. A large number of soldiers and planters had now joined them with swords, revolvers, and muskets. Aided by their fresh engine, and with their little army, onward they now flew with almost the speed of the wind. The obstructions which the fugitives threw behind them were speedily removed. At length they came to a place where 3 rails had been torn up and carried away. They could drive their locomotive no further. With great promptness and energy, they abandoned the engine, ran along the track 2 miles, met the down freight train near Adairsville, reversed the train, ran back to the station, switched the train off the sidetrack, turned the engine, and rushed on to Calhoun. Here they gathered a new force of men to pursue the fugitives, a telegraph operator, and workmen to repair the road. Again they were rushing forward with almost frenzied speed. As they were turning a curve, they caught a glimpse of the now crippled engine they were pursuing, scarcely a mile ahead of them. The adventurers had stopped a moment to tear up the track. Hearing the approach of the foe, they sprang upon their car and again sped away. The pursuers in hot haste came to the spot where the rails were torn up. Their workmen with the necessary tools instantly tore up the rails behind them and replaced those which were taken away. The fight and the chase were now exciting beyond all power of words to describe. The locomotives were frequently in sight of each other. The engine of the Patriots was rapidly failing. Wood and water were nearly gone, and the unoiled boxes were almost melting with heat. In this their extremity, they uncoupled 2 of the boxcars and left them to slow the pursuers. But the energetic pursuers pushed the cars before them to the first turnout, and were soon within 400 yards of their victims. Only then our adventurers leaped from the car and took to the woods. We now turn to the prisoners in their dismal dungeon. To be continued. Tune back in soon for the conclusion of this incredible story. This story came from the great state of New Jersey, being reported in the West Jersey Pioneer of September 23rd, 1870. Thank you for joining us today. If you want to continue to uncover all of America's lost and forgotten history, then remember before you leave to hit the subscribe button, hit the notification bell, and remember to like and comment below. And we will see you next time on Americana Archives.